Thank you all for being here today. Wish we could, of course, be there in person, but we've got some exciting things to announce. And 2 weeks out of the election, a lot of things are happening that we wanted to inform you of. Most importantly, as of today, more than 3 million Michigan citizens have requested their ballots, which is really an extraordinary number. We've been estimating all along that 3 million citizens would vote early. To have reached this benchmark 2 weeks prior to the polls closing, when we know that number will continue to climb, is really quite remarkable and shows we're well on our way to have more people vote in this year's election than ever before. Also notable is that nearly everyone who's requested their ballot has received their ballot. There's only a gap of about 20,000 who are still waiting throughout the state, which when you're talking about 3 million is, it's an important number. We're working through it, and we can expect they'll receive their ballots this week, if not already. But certainly the fact that most have already, or nearly all of those 3 million already have ballots in hand is really an exceptional reflection of the hard work of our clerks all around the state. Who have turned around these ballot requests in record time, and I'm really grateful for that. In addition to that, over 50% of voters have already returned and voted those ballots. Over 1.5 million citizens have already voted this year, and when you reflect on the fact that total 4.799 million, just under 4.8 million, voted in the November 2016 election. The fact that 2 weeks out, already 3 million have voted early in this, or are on track to vote early in this election, is just extraordinary, and a reflection of the hard work that citizens put into amending our state constitution to create a right to vote by mail or early or prior to election day, and more than anything, the hard work of our election workers all across the state who have stepped up and really been on the front lines of receiving these requests, validating them, turning them around, and now receiving the ballots back and verifying that. It also demonstrates that citizens are enormously enthusiastic about participating in our democracy this election, and I believe it really underscores the success of our office in informing citizens and ensuring they know of their rights to vote by mail. And these are new options. This is the first election cycle, major election cycle, where we've seen these options in place, and we've been working methodically to ensure voters knew about them, and we continue to do that. But the fact that the voters on all sides throughout the state are responding by requesting ballots and returning them early, and that our infrastructure is set up to make all of that happen, is just an extraordinary success story. And the fact that it's all happened in the midst of a pandemic makes it all the more remarkable. So please thank your local clerks. This is a tremendous reflection on their hard work all across the state, because they are the ones making this happen and have been working alongside of us throughout this process in preparing for November to ensure that we were ready for exactly this. And then I can't, the last thing I'll say on this, because I want to talk about a couple more things, is that these numbers also underscore that citizens are confident in the integrity of our vote by mail system, our early voting system, our drop boxes. They are taking advantage of what we have built over the past year. They are taking advantage of their options to vote despite unprecedented levels of misinformation that they are receiving and that we are hearing all around the country. So I believe this is really a hopeful story. It's not a partisan story. It's not, again, we see citizens on both sides of the aisle taking advantage of these opportunities, and that's really a great thing, a remarkable thing. And I'm really proud of the hard work that's gone into making this happen. And we still got 2 weeks to go. So we'll continue to update you on the numbers as we go ahead. But passing this milestone today, 2 weeks out, was particularly significant. We wanted to emphasize it. We're also shifting to the 2-week period. So we want your help in getting out information that now at this point, in addition to announcing these numbers, we want voters to know, and we want to encourage anyone with a platform to amplify 3 things. Number one, if voters already have a ballot, if they're one of the 3 million who already requested and received a ballot, at this point, we want you to return that ballot through your local drop box or at your local clerk's office. You're of course welcome to return it through the mail, But because every ballot must be received by 8 p.m. on election day, we want to ensure that every valid vote counts and is received on time. So those drop boxes are there for a reason, for that avenue, and of course returning in person at your local drop box as well. And please let folks know they can track their ballot from start to finish to when it's been received by their clerk at michigan.gov/vote. The second thing we want to emphasize and amplify, and then we want voters to know, is that if they don't have a ballot already, they can today or up until Monday prior to election day pick up that ballot at their local clerk's office. They can of course still request to have it mailed to them, but again, this close to the election, we're encouraging everyone to simply, if you still want to vote early, go to your local clerk's office, or if you're in a larger community, a satellite clerk's office. For example, there are 21 satellite clerk's offices in the city of Detroit alone, as well as many others throughout the state. Go there to pick up your ballot and vote. If you want, vote your ballot right there. And of course, you know, if you don't have your ballot and you don't want to vote early, you have the right and option to vote in person on election day. If you do vote in person on election day, I'll talk a little bit about the safety provisions that we are working to put in place for in-person election day voting. But before that, I want to emphasize that local clerks' offices and satellite offices are a portal for people getting their ballots and returning their ballots now 2 weeks out. And then also importantly, the third thing is voter registration. As of today, if voters are not registered but still want to vote in this year's election, they can. They just have to register in person with residency verification at their local clerk's office. So we want to encourage everyone to know, if you're not registered, you can still register and vote. You just have to do it in person in these last 2 weeks on election and on election day itself at your local clerk's office. And you can get the address and location of your local clerk's office or a satellite office at michigan.gov/vote. Importantly, if you are registering to vote in these last 14 days at your clerk's office, you can get your ballot at the same time, fill it out and return it right then and there, so you can do everything in one visit. So it's very important for voters to know. These avenues still exist. They're going to be safe and secure and available for voters up until election day. And we appreciate your help getting this information out to voters, because we know there's still millions who want to vote and will vote and will want to know these options as we get into these final 2 weeks. The final thing I'll just mention of what we want to amplify and emphasize in these final 2 weeks is to empower everyone, particularly our citizens, to combat misinformation. We've set up an email, misinformation@michigan.gov, to give people a way to report misinformation. We'll be updating our website also in the days ahead with more information of how to report misinformation. But importantly, michigan.gov/election security details everything that we are doing to secure our elections. And we encourage you to either point people to that or to amplify that, to let people know that that's where they can find out about the security protocols in place for their ballots and for our election infrastructure. And it's also where we will be responding to misinformation that we continue to hear in the weeks ahead, of course, or in the days ahead. Of course, if citizens or anyone reports misinformation to our email at our email portal, misinformation@michigan.gov, that immediately gets investigated. Any credible complaints of voter intimidation or things that rise to illegality, we refer to the Attorney General's office for further investigation. And as an example, with the past robocall that was sent to thousands of our voters that was misinformation, we did just that. And that's an example of how we will swiftly seek to hold those accountable who would seek to undermine our citizens' faith in our elections or their knowledge of how to vote in this process. Finally, almost finally, two more things. Just one more note on election security, because we're going to hear a lot about the security of the vote in the days ahead and even after the polls close. Here's the truth that we want voters to know. Number one, our absentee voting system, or our early voting system, has been time tested over decades. We've implemented various secure protocols, which are both detailed at michigan.gov/election security, as well as have been detailed many times already by myself in conversations with many of you. The signature protocols that are in place require election workers to confirm a voter's identity if a signature is missing or mismatched or doesn't match on the ballot envelope once received. Importantly, only valid ballots will count. Only valid ballots with a signature that matches a voter's signature on file will count, with an additional factor that clerks will follow up with anyone missing a signature or mismatching a signature to confirm those voters' identity and either identify irregularities or confirm a valid ballot and count that. That signature cure is now required under law. We've been working with our clerks to ensure they're prepared to do that by issuing standards and all the rest. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that all valid ballots will be counted by bipartisan pairs of election workers who are trained to ensure that votes are tallied without political bias and in accordance with election law. We welcome you to reach out to your clerks, our local clerks, to verify and talk about this procedure, but we need your help in really clarifying this procedure to voters because we anticipate there will continue to be a lot of misinformation with these millions of citizens voting early or voting by mail. And we really just want to make sure the facts are out there about the secure protocols we've got set up in the system to ensure that only valid ballots count and that to the greatest extent possible, under the law, every ballot will count. Last thing, I want to talk a little bit about Election Day and then we'll take some questions. I want to be clear that voters who choose to cast ballots on Election Day at their polling places will also be safe and secure. That is a priority of my office. And as I've mentioned repeatedly throughout this election cycle, myself and the Attorney General are dedicated to using every tool at our disposal to ensure indeed that every polling place throughout our state, every voting area is safe and secure. In particular, in a pandemic, this means no crowding and no long lines. We are on track for success to ensure that our polling places are free of crowding because even in this record turnout election that we're anticipating, we have successfully encouraged and educated voters on their option to vote early, either by mail or at their clerk's office. With today's announcement, we're on track to see more than 2/3 of our citizens voting in this year's election voting early, which puts us on track to have people turning out at the polls on Election Day, but not in the numbers that we saw even in 2016, where 3.6 million voters participated and voted on Election Day at the polls. So by providing other options, we've been able to be on track to minimize crowding at the polls, and that's an important thing. You're not seeing that in every state, but it's something we've done successfully in Michigan and that we're on track to see successfully on Election Day. We're also visiting polling locations throughout the state, and particularly in our larger jurisdictions, to ensure they're ready to go on Election Day. We've recruited over 30,000 new election workers who we are training and placing throughout the state to ensure our clerks have the staff they need to do the extraordinary jobs that they're doing right now. And then we've also provided for every election worker PPE, masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, sneeze guards, social distancing protocols for precincts that require voting booths to be spaced out within 6 feet to comply with CDC guidelines. So the bottom line, from a health standpoint, we've done and we are doing all that data and best practices indicate are needed to ensure safe access to the polls on Election Day. And of course, physical safety is critical as well. And much has been made of threats to our voters in the past several weeks and to our elected officials. And we take those threats seriously, as you all know. And I take my role as the state's chief election officer very seriously in ensuring my responsibility to make sure our voting areas are free of voter intimidation and of threats of harassment. And that's the reason why we have issued a narrowly tailored directive barring open carry of firearms in or within 100 feet of voting areas. This also applies to clerk's offices and AV counting boards, because the bottom line is we just want to keep people safe. And we want to ensure and we want to recognize that the threat of open carrying of firearms can create a threatening environment through both visual and other ways. And the state constitution, which provides a right to vote for our citizens, the federal constitution, which makes voting a fundamental right, as well as state and federal law that bans efforts to intimidate voters at the polls on Election Day, gives my office the legal authority to ensure that we are protecting every vote and issuing directives to ensure every voter knows that they will be safe and secure when they vote in person. Of course, Michigan citizens have the right to bear arms, and those with a license to carry a concealed weapon may continue to do so in places where that's allowed. This is not a ban on firearms. This is an effort to protect our voters from intimidation, threats, and harassment on Election Day itself. So, and also I'll mention the importance of clarity. that one of the other interests furthered by this directive was that we didn't want to place the burden on local election officials or poll workers to figure out if they encountered threats or harassment on election day that involved the open carry of weapons or firearms. We didn't want to put the burden on them to figure out the best way to proceed. The goal is to provide clarity, leadership, and partnership with our law enforcement, particularly Michigan State Police, who announced and supported this directive with us, along with the Attorney General. And I'm confident that our expectation that Election Day will go smoothly and will be as successful as our work preparing for Election Day has been, will continue to be the reality in our state, and that millions of citizens in Michigan will be able to vote this fall without incident, either prior to or on Election Day itself. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Secretary. We'll take questions. We'll go two at a time, just in the order they've come in. So it's Jim Kurtzner, followed by Lindsay McCormick.
Good morning, Secretary. Jim Kurtzner.
I could not hear anyone. I don't know if this is...
Hang on just a second, folks. Let's figure out the audio issue.
I think my volume is not working. There we go. I should be able to hear someone now.
Can you hear me now? Jocelyn?
A little bit.
A little bit.
Okay, that's fixed.
How about now?
That should work.
Good?
I can hear you now.
So we're going in the order they've been coming in. So we've got Jim Kurtzner, followed by Lindsay McCormick. Go ahead, Jim.
Can you hear me now?
I can, yeah, sorry, we fixed it.
Oh, okay, very good. I don't know how much you heard of my question. I'll condense it this way. There are local police and sheriffs who are saying your directive is not enforceable and they will not enforce it. And even the sheriff of Livingston County says, while you can say Michigan State Police will fill that gap, he's saying there aren't enough of those officers. So how do you respond to their saying that, and even their use of discretion saying we are not going to enforce your directive?
My understanding, as you mentioned, is that Michigan State Police are going to enforce the ban anywhere that local law enforcement is unable or unwilling to do so. And my bottom line is no voter intimidation will be tolerated, and I'm grateful for those partners in law enforcement, both at the state and local level, who recognize that as well.
Lindsay?
And are you concerned about a legal challenge?
I feel very confident, both as an attorney who practiced election law and constitutional law, and as a law dean, and with our consultation with the Attorney General, that my authority to protect voters from threats and harassment and intimidation on Election Day when exercising their fundamental right to vote is well grounded in the law. It's both state and federal. And my job and my duty and the role that voters have asked me to play as the chief election officer is to enforce the law in this way and ensure they're protected on Election Day, especially at this really critical moment in our state and in our state's history. So I'm focused on doing my job and doing what I and the Attorney General and many others through well-established case law and precedent have underscored is allowed and is permitted and is part of my role and responsibility as the state's chief election officer.
Lindsay McCormick, followed by Jacob Kankler.
Hi, Secretary Lindsay McCormick here with Wood TV in Grand Rapids. Thanks for taking some time today. My question is also related to the open carry ban. I've been in touch with county clerks in West Michigan, and some of the response I'm hearing is that this will actually potentially create problems that weren't previously at the polls because of people coming to challenge this directive. How was that possibility taken into account when deciding to put the directive out there?
Well, we certainly saw a number of pieces of information and no specific threats, but a lot of concerns from voters all across the state that was expressed to us, as well as to clerks. In fact, I actually checked in with clerks prior to and after making this announcement, and they said, by and large, thank you for doing this and taking the burden off of us to have to perhaps intermittently deal with threats and harassment on election day without clarity from the state on what is and isn't permitted. So as I've said, I'm grateful for the 1,500 clerks and 83 county clerks all around our state who have been working to make these elections work. I recognize that not everyone is always going to agree with what is needed, but based on the data, facts, legal precedent, and history, and all of the other information that was brought to my attention, including from local clerks and mayors and law enforcement at the state and local level. This was a very clear, important thing to do this fall to, again, simply just protect every voter in their exercise of the vote and make sure polling places are a place where we know are going to be safe and the right to vote would be sacred, and to empower those who would protect that right and the sacred place of that polling place to be able to do so with a clear understanding of what is and is not allowed.
Jacob, followed by Kristen Lowe.
Hey, Secretary. My question kind of gets into your answer a little bit, but maybe you can expand on it. What if there were no specific threats, what were you hearing from clerks that kind of drove you to issue the directive on the open carry? I mean, was there a sense that more people were indicating that they wanted to, show up and intimidate voters? Was there just confusion over what's allowed? Can you just expand on what kind of is the driving force behind this?
And clarity, as I mentioned, clarity across the state was key. We didn't want people to feel on election day any uncertainty about what to do, because that can also amplify chaos and threats and intimidation as they occur. We want to ensure everyone's prepared with that clarity, and that law enforcement as well is prepared with clear directives as to what is and is not permissible in our election polling places, just as campaigning is not allowed, which is of course another well-established protection for voters in the polling place. We wanted to ensure that clarity was provided to our local election officials, to our poll workers, and what I've received back in terms of feedback is relief for that clarity, and because it shouldn't be on them on election day to try to figure out what to do if there is any threat or intimidation or harassment at the polls. They should have clear protocols and clear protections in place for our voters. We wanted to then give voters that clarity and assurance as well. I mean, this issue was beginning to dominate conversations with voters, with elected officials. Of course, we know it's been dominating with the threats against the governor and other state officials and lawmakers. It's been dominating much of the conversation. And so recognizing that, we want to make sure people are safe and they're not fearful that if they vote in person on election day, that anything bad's going to happen. We want them to be confident that their votes are going to count and that they won't risk their health or their safety in order to vote. And so that's the bottom line at a time when, again, there's enormous enthusiasm in the state for citizens of all backgrounds and all perspectives to vote. There's increasing chatter and misinformation and efforts to undermine that confidence and in various different ways. This is an effort to head that off, to protect our voters, to protect the sanctity of our polling places, and to protect that fundamental right that every citizen has to cast their ballot free from intimidation or threats or harassment.
Kristen, followed by Kathy Gray.
Hi, Secretary. Kristen Lowe with Mid-Michigan Now in Flint. My question has to do with absentee ballots. What happens in Michigan if you fill out a ballot and then you die before Election Day? And if you have this number offhand, in the primary, how many votes were discarded because people died?
To answer your second question, Jake can certainly get you the specific number. I believe it was around 800, but that's just off the top of my head based on my past memorization of that data. But Jake can get you the specific number. But yes, and to answer your question, it is under Michigan law. A voter has to be alive on Election Day in order for their vote to count.
Kathy, followed by Beth LeBlanc.
Good afternoon. I'm wondering what is the main piece of misinformation or the main pieces of misinformation that you're hearing about in this election cycle? Threats
on, well, gosh, I would say two things. One, concerns or threats about what will happen if you vote by mail or vote early, that your ballot won't count, that it won't, that the vote by mail system is not secure, sort of everything tied up in the ability for citizens to vote early this year, either through the mail or at their polling places. That misinformation around that has been prevalent leading up to Election Day. The millions of people who have chosen to vote early anyway shows it has not been successful. Yet at the same time, I'm very aware of the potential for various voices and others with platforms to continue to try to undermine citizens' faith in the security of the vote by mail process or simply the absentee voting process. That's why my office has emphasized not only the security protocols that we have in place and letting people know about them, but also combating the misinformation that we've seen in robocalls and other types of social media postings about the security of ballots that are voted early. And so we're going to continue to be very mindful of that because, again, I think that's the topic and the actual manifestation or what is specifically said to undermine the confidence voters have in that early voting process. Is the specifics are going to continue to evolve and take different forms. But it is something that I would say we've seen to be a preeminent message point in these past several weeks, which again, the numbers today show it hasn't been successful because people are still choosing to vote absentee. However, now that we're 2 weeks out and getting closer to Election Day, we're more, those who have not yet voted are more likely to vote on Election Day, although we're still tracking that data. I do anticipate, in addition to everything I just said, that a lot of the misinformation may shift to try to scare people away from voting in person. And we're already starting to see some inklings of that. And that's part of the reason why this directive, this clarification, the effort to provide PPE and health and safety guidelines for our clerks as well, recruiting election workers, everything we've done to protect the safety and security of polling places has been also with preparation of the knowledge that there may be efforts to continue to try to dampen voters' faith in voting in person on Election Day through various different ways. So it's a long-winded way of saying the misinformation we've seen mostly up to this point has been mostly about the absentee voting process. I anticipate we may see a shift now as we get closer to Election Day to see more misinformation targeting voters who are voting in person. But we're tracking that, we're mindful of that, and we're ready for that because, again, I see my responsibility this year is making sure every voter knows their right to vote and feels very confident in expressing their voice and their vote.
Beth LeBlanc will be our last question because we're out of time.
Hi, Secretary. Thanks for taking questions today. With the SCOTUS decision last night in Pennsylvania, do you expect that to have any impact on Michigan's timeframe for accepting late ballots, or should everyone just operate under the understanding that everything should be in on Election Day?
We're continuing to tell voters to get your votes in by 8 p.m. on Election Day, whether it's through mail, your local drop box, or in person at your clerk if you're voting absentee. And the reason for that is we recognize the litigation, as we all seen in Michigan, has gone back and forth and essentially has the potential to create a lot of uncertainty around that. As that works its way out, both at our state and at the federal level, our messaging, our guidance to voters, my recommendations to voters has never wavered. Vote early, get your votes. If you choose to vote early, get your vote in as soon as possible, but no later than 8 p.m. on Election Day. And again, this is one of the reasons why we installed over 1,000 secure drop boxes all across the state for just this very moment. Now, 2 weeks out, we want voters to use those as opposed to using the mail to return their ballots. So the bottom line for me is I want to ensure every valid vote counts. And that's what every single effort of my office has been about this entire process. And so we'll continue to see and how that all plays out. But for voters, our recommendation is now 2 weeks out. The mail-in option is still available, but we don't recommend it because there's just so much uncertainty and so many variables there. What we do recommend is you pick up your ballot in person at your clerk's office. If you'd like to vote absentee or early, you can do that up until 4 p.m. on November 2nd. And then if you have a ballot, or when you have a ballot, return it either through your local drop box or your local clerk's office or a satellite office. And voters can get all of that information in terms of including the locations of those offices and those drop boxes at michigan.gov/vote.